there can be a gap between our inaccurate self-perceptions and actual reality. And when this occurs, we label it as being incongruence, much as we talked about that we have an ideal self and there's a gap between what we think an ideal self is and who we actually think we are. Now, when we have incongruence, these distortions and incongruence develop and are magnified in things like self-fulfilling prophecies and filtering. Now, self-fulfilling prophecies are events that happen as a result of being foretold, expected, or talked about. And they can be self-created or they can actually be other-imposed on us. And it's very interesting because when we're talking about self-fulfilling prophecies, it really points out that our expectations have a huge impact on how we view the world around us, especially ourselves. And what's very interesting about our experiences in life is that we look for things to meet our expectations and fulfill those expectations. And so if you, for example, have a very negative view of yourself in a certain area or a skill, or you have a negative view of an experience that's coming up in your life, you think it's going to be awful, then chances are you're going to look for your expectations to be fulfilled in that experience, or you're going to look for your expectation to be fulfilled and that you're not as strong at that skill as you thought you were. A good example of this is when students sign up for courses. Some people go to ratemyprofessor.com or they ask their friends, and what are they doing? Well, they're just getting an idea of what that particular professor or course is going to be like. And in many cases, it helps to reduce our uncertainty, which can be very positive for many of us seeking information. However, as we seek that information to reduce our uncertainty, it sets up for us expectations for the future. And chances are we're actually going to look for those expectations to be fulfilled. So if you think, oh my gosh, I got stuck with such and such professor, or oh, I'm pigeonholed into taking that COM 170 class with Spradley. Have you heard about her? Well, that's going to affect how you then see and experience future events. And what we create for ourselves are self-fulfilling prophecies, which we may ourselves impose or others may impose those on us. Now, also filtering has an impact on distortion related to self and identity. What happens is we tend to selectively perceive information that's coming in, and as we selectively perceive it, what we do is we filter out that which we don't want. And in some cases, what we'll do if, for example, we have very positive self-esteem in a certain area, maybe we think we're a really good writer, or maybe you think you're a really good singer, and if you hear a message that's contrary to that, maybe you downplay it, or you just completely ignore it altogether, and that way you focus then on the only messages that reinforce what you think. And the negative could be true as well, in the sense that you have a negative view of yourself in a certain area and you filter out messages that might change your view. And we tend to stick with the status quo in regard to the distortions and incongruence that we have, rather than looking for change. However, change is definitely possible. Now, let's move on and talk about perceptions of others. In looking at perceptions of others and how they form, there are two key theories that I want to bring up. First is uncertainty reduction theory, and then second is impression management theory. Uncertainty reduction theory is a very popular theory related to initial interactions that we have with others, and that in those initial interactions, there's a lot of uncertainty related to the relationship. Where is it going? Who's this other person? How are they going to react to me? And what we're trying to do is we're trying to predict their behavior so we feel more comfortable with them. It doesn't mean that if we get more information we're going to necessarily like them or want to engage in a long-term intimate relationship with them. That's not what it means. It just means that we would like to be in more predictable patterns of communication. And what we use normally, or primarily in those initial interactions, are cultural level predictors, which are usually related to the way somebody looks. And so we rely very heavily on stereotypes, like age, race, clothing, and things like that. And secondly, we have sociological level predictions, which are related usually to the other person's group membership, which is why we ask people things like, where do you work? What organizations are you involved in? Because that gives us an indication from our point of view what kind of groups the other person associates with, and may give indications also of things like their values, their interests, and things along that nature. Now, what's unfortunate is that we can rely on stereotypes quite heavily in those cultural level and sociological level predictions, which doesn't give us a whole lot of intimate information about the other person. They're not deeper levels of disclosure. So you really have to have ongoing relationship with someone to move past uncertainty reduction to get into patterns of behavior that are a little bit more predictable for you and your relational partner. A second type of theory that we look at is related to impression management. And there are a number of theories that we're going to talk about this semester that are related to impression management, including politeness theory. But impression management is consciously influencing the impression that one has on others. And you may have woken up today and put on a certain outfit because you knew that someone was going to see you and you wanted to make a good impression on them. Or maybe you can think of one of your first job interviews that you ever had to go on for a part-time job that you really wanted. And maybe you looked the part. You dressed the part, so to speak. And I can remember back when I was in grade school, like the most important thing was what I wore on the first day of school. So we all engage in impression management to some degree. And these two theories, uncertainty reduction theory and impression management, help to explain in our social interactions how we perceive others and how we engage in those relationships. There are some perceptual problems, though, in how we formulate our social perceptions of others. One is implicit personality theory, which looks at how our initial impressions become expectations for the future, and what we do is these expectations are reinforced in subsequent encounters. So even if someone does something that would actually alleviate or be contrary to our expectations, what we will do is we'll re-explain it, we'll reinterpret it in a way that actually reinforces the expectation that we have. So let's say you, in your initial encounters with somebody, think, oh my gosh, that person was so arrogant. Golly, could they get off talking about themselves for 5 minutes? Everything was about them. And in future encounters, even if they probably ask you a lot of questions about you, every time that they refer back to themselves, it's just going to reinforce to you that they're arrogant, and so therefore that's going to be an impression of them no matter what else they say or do in those subsequent encounters. So that's just an example of implicit personality theory. We also have halo effect, which is when we perceive a grouping of related traits associated with the person, even though you haven't really observed the person exhibiting all of those traits. So, for example, if you think someone's arrogant in initial encounters, you might also think that they're stingy, that they aren't very generous, that they aren't complimentary of other people, and so on. Even though you haven't really observed them doing any of those things or acting in that way or that being a part of their personality, but you associate it with arrogance, and so you bring all these other expectations in with arrogance, and that's what we would label as halo effect. And both with implicit personality theory and halo effect doesn't have to be a negative impression. It could be a positive impression as well, something like warmth or friendliness or generosity. Also, we engage in selective perception, and I mentioned this earlier in that we focus on only one stimuli, or we focus on one behavior, and that seems to be our entire focus, and we actually filter out other behaviors and don't pay attention to them.